Thank you very much. Ronald just asked me to do my New York accent, but if I do that, it sounds like I come from Pakistan, so it's probably better I stick to what I've got. And I'd also like to thank Ronald for his very kind words. Chatham House was a very difficult period in my life, and it was so precisely because I felt that in an institute which was defined by independent thinking on international affairs, you could actually have independent views on the state of Israel. And I found that that was somewhat problematic, shall I say, and I'm eternally grateful for Ronald's support and for the welcome I've always had at the World Jewish Congress with you, this time in Hungary, other times in Jerusalem, but wherever it has been, it has always been a privilege. Just before I go through the report, which I think all of you have in front of you, a short video has been prepared, so if we could just have that now and dim the lights. So you can see from those very disturbing images that this is not some theoretical discussion. This is a real-world discussion about events that are happening in the continent in which we're gathered today, in the continent of Europe. When Ronald phoned me up and we talked about doing this report, it struck me at the time, but then subsequently it was a cause of some sort of soul-searching as to how we even use the term neo-Nazi. You know, on the one hand, we don't want to overuse the term, but on the other hand, one shouldn't be afraid to use it where appropriate. You know, one can get to a stage of being so interested in the fine nuances of the definition that you then forget that, no, actually, we're trying to define this in order to act, in order to circumvent it, in order to prevent it, in order to extinguish it. And there's also a distinction that does need to be drawn, though, between neo-Nazis and the far right. And far right is a term which is used, a very malleable term, which is used often to describe, most usually in Europe, to describe political parties that are interested in curbing immigration or are themselves hostile to large-scale communities which have grown up in European countries through past immigration. That is not neo-Nazism. One may agree with it, one may disagree with it, but it's not neo-Nazi. It may set the background music for neo-Nazi groups to flourish, but I think it's important, much as I said we shouldn't over-intellectualize, we also shouldn't describe everybody and anything that resembles the right of the spectrum or the far right of the spectrum as neo-Nazism. I think it's clear, and if you look at the introduction to the report, which you all have in front of you, that the groups that we're looking at and the case studies we used are Greece, Hungary, and Germany, each to illustrate a different point of contention, a different issue that we need to address. And it is clear that this toxic combination of extreme anti-Semitic discourse, aggressive national chauvinism, and anti-capitalist and anti-socialist rhetoric, that inherent contradiction in Nazi ideology, is sufficiently present in the parties I'm about to outline to make the use of the word neo-Nazi appropriate. I think until the last few years, we've tended to assume that neo-Nazi parties, neo-Nazis are essentially just skinheads, not to diminish their importance and the dangers that they pose to communities across the continent, and not just on this continent as well. But they're fringe parties, they're mavericks, they're people that we don't like, but we can deride and we can push to the fringes of our thinking. And what is new and worrying is that the kind of ideological tenets that I described, which I think are a reasonable approximation to a definition of neo-Nazism, of course nothing that happens in the 21st century, no movement, is going to be an exact replica of the German Nazi party that ruled from 1933 to 1945. If we're going to use that kind of definition, we'll never get off the ground in the discussion because the world has changed, politics has changed, culture has changed, the economy, much as we've got a pretty bad backdrop right now, has changed as well. And we decided to use these three case studies, and if you look into the report, the first one is Golden Dawn. And Golden Dawn in Greece is an interesting case and a very worrying case, because of course it takes place, and this is the central point I think that the Greek case illustrates, it takes place amid very severe economic downturn. According to government figures, since the economic depression, in the Greek case is the correct word, started 2007 to 2008, the Greek economy has declined by about 20%. So they've lost a fifth of their economy. Unemployment is at 27%, youth unemployment at over 60% now. And that sets the background to the situation in which Golden Dawn has managed to rise. But if you think about it, there are plenty of other protest parties that people could have gone to. You could have gone to the far left, which will also mop up a lot of the disillusionment that people feel about economic depression. So it can't just be the economic backdrop. There must be something in the cultural and political side which resonates in such a way that Golden Dawn has now managed to make itself the third biggest party, according to the opinion polls in Greece. And you'll see that in the report, it's broken down, and it should be intuitive and easy to get hold of. The origins, development, and context. This is a party which began around a shady magazine in 1980, formed as a party in 1985. By 1993, it was formally recognized as a party. And then it had its first electoral, I wouldn't call it success, but in the parliamentary European elections in 1994, it got 0.1%, 0.11, if you want to be pedantic, percent of the vote. Now that it's 20 years later, or just less than 20 years later, on about 12 to 13%, according to the very latest polls, there's an illustration that over a relatively short period of time, a very dangerous political party can make inroads to the extent that it actually captures world attention and influences politics in its own country, in the country of Greece. What does Golden Dawn stand for? It is the mix of neo-Nazi style thinking that I described. It rages at the international political and economic system. It associates the international political and economic system with Jews. The core leadership fundamentally believes in Jewish conspiracies. It is violent at the grassroots level. Its people use violence on the streets. There was a famous case on Greek television in June 2012, which some of you may have seen. It went all over YouTube, where a Golden Dawn parliamentarian slapped a female communist MP 3 times across the face, full, hard, sort of haymaker-style slap across the face. And what was interesting, and when I went to Greece, people told me that was a kind of, it was a sort of turning point in a sense of people's perception of Golden Dawn, because all the analysts thought, well, this will no longer be tolerated. The Greek people that formerly supported Golden Dawn will want to have nothing to do with what is little better than hooliganism, in fact is hooliganism, on national television. Quite the opposite happened. Golden Dawn support remained steady and then increased in the Greek context, precisely because it was therefore, through this kind of what we would all regard as outrageous actions, able to embed in the public consciousness this notion that they thrive on, that they are the party representing revenge against the system. And that is a phrase that I've heard. It's typical of neo-Nazi movements that they are the ones that are claiming to stand up for the little man, the little woman, the person that's been oppressed by global economic forces, by the Jews, by immigrants, and so on. And I think that what is illustrative there as well, and this is one of the issues that we discussed in all of the 3 case studies, is the response of the government. Now, it doesn't appear that the governing party is collaborationist. It's just that in the context of economic depression, where it's effectively spending every waking hour trying to revive the Greek economy, other issues like Golden Dawn slip down the list of priorities. That's point 1, and point 2 in the Greek case. There have been widespread accusations, it's still controversial, but widespread accusations, which you'll see in the report, that the police and security forces within the police and security forces, there are sympathizers and supporters of Golden Dawn that turn a blind eye to what Golden Dawn is doing at the grassroots level. So take a look at that and hold that in your thinking as to one example. The second example, of course, is the one that we've had brought to our attention here in Hungary, the case of Jobbik. And Jobbik has to be understood, and the reason this will also help understand, I think, why Prime Minister Orbán, there are 2 reasons why Prime Minister Orbán responded or did not respond, I think perhaps more accurately, the way he did to President Lula's speech the other day. One is, I've lived in this part of the world for a long time, and about 5 or 6 years ago, a friend of mine from Hungary explained to me that if you want to understand Hungary, think about the way people talk about real estate. Say there are 3 rules of real estate: location, location, location. There are 3 things you need to understand about modern-day Hungary. Trianon, Trianon, Trianon. In 1920, Hungary was cut not by 1/3, but took 1/3 of its previous size, something which is considered across the Hungarian nation as an enduring national tragedy. And that is why, whether it be Jobbik or even Fidesz, which is Mr. Orbán, the Prime Minister's party, when they're called to address issues such as the Horthy regime, the regime which ruled Hungary until 1944, they have tremendous difficulty, and to put it I'm putting it in its most generous formulation, in coming to terms with their own responsibility for their past, because the overriding sense of what it is to be Hungarian in the world is a sense of being a victim. And it's that sense of being victimized that informs, I think, the central part of a national narrative within which groups like Jobbik can grow up. Now, Jobbik, of course, is a different kettle of fish from Mr. Orbán's party, Fidesz. On the other hand, it's very clear, and you'll see plenty of quotations within the report, that the conflict, the reason why President Lauder's point about, will you condemn Jobbik, will you talk about the Horthy regime, the reason is, quite simply, apart from the ideological side, which I just very briefly set out, is that ultimately Fidesz believes that Jobbik splits the right-wing vote. And if Prime Minister Orbán goes too hard against Jobbik, with elections coming up next year, he's worried he won't be able to scoop up their votes. And then even worse than that, because of the state of the opinion polls, in 2010, Prime Minister Orbán won an almost unprecedented in modern Europe victory with 52.7% of the vote. And in a proportional representation system, that is extremely rare. But now his opinion ratings are down to about 22%. It's highly unlikely he will get a majority in elections next year. What's the natural party to go for, either as a coalition partner or as somebody to support him from the opposition benches? All of these things come into play in the Hungarian case. The third element of the report, the case study about the National Democratic Party, NPD, with the German abbreviation, is a very different, and one would expect it to be different in the German context, a different case. The NPD has made inroads in 2 East German states, but it has no presence on the national federal level. It got, I think, 1.5% at the last election. The issue in Germany is not that the neo-Nazis are about to enter the mainstream political system. What is illustrative and important about the German case is the way the authorities have tried and failed to ban the party. They tried in 2003, just 10 years ago, 2003. There's a very interesting reason why they failed at the Constitutional Court, because the party had been so heavily infiltrated by secret services, by collaborators, by informers, that the Constitutional Court ruled that it was unable to distinguish between the authentic actions of the party itself and the influence that the government, which was bringing the case, might have had on party actions and rhetoric. It's a very difficult conundrum to resolve. It's a very controversial issue right now, ahead of the German elections in September, because there have been calls from the Jewish community in Germany, but also within the political system, within the states, Germany's 16 states, to push for a ban of the NPD, and the government backed away from that. The government backed away, basically arguing that the situation would not be materially different from what it was 10 years ago, that they would lose. And there was a famous quotation from the chairman of the Free Democrats, which is the junior coalition partner in the German government of Angela Merkel, saying, "You can't ban stupidity." And I was having a conversation with friends and colleagues here from Germany who noted, how should I put it, with a sense of sadness, that reference to neo-Nazism and the Holocaust was being put in the same bracket as stupidity. We all thought it was something a little bit more serious than that. Nonetheless, this is not to slate the German government. This is not an easy issue. You know, if you're going to try and ban a party, it may be actually worse to attempt to do something which is going to fail than not to. That's debatable. I'm not making a statement one way or the other. And I think, since I've blatantly gone over my allotted time, I shall close here. You have the recommendations at the back of the report. And I think one of the key ones to to bear in mind, and perhaps given that I sort of closed off, as it were, on the NPD in Germany, is this question of what to do about this from a legal point of view. In Germany, if the Constitutional Court is not going to be able to ban it, then do we then try and get the German political system to change the constitution? I mean, I don't know the answers to these questions, and this, I think, is where we need expert advice from constitutional lawyers, not just in the German case, but in the Hungarian case and in the Greek case, and also, therefore, to provide us with the wherewithal to deal with other parties that arise in other parts of Europe, so that we're as well prepared as we possibly can be to deal with this from whichever perspective and whichever style of approach we decide to take. So with that, I'll close, and we'll move now to a discussion. Yes, Ronald was just pointing out to me, yeah, I mean, it is in every country. It's in the three that I referred to. It's actually got itself into the parliamentary system. But this virus has spread across Europe, and there are smaller parties which may be able to cross, often in the European, for Americans may not be familiar with this, in the European parliamentary context, actually it's very much like the Israeli one, but not 2% threshold. There is a threshold for parliamentary representation. Well, if it's 4% or 5%, and you're at 3.5%, then you could be at breakthrough stage. So it certainly is something we have to watch out for across the whole of the continent.